Hi everyone and welcome back to another True Crime Tuesday video. So I don't mean to offend any of the friends and family involved in this video. I've basically just done a load of research and then tried to put it into an educational video for you guys. In 1978 at California Men's Colony, two felons, Lawrence Bittaker, aged 38, and Roy Norris, aged 30, formed a friendship with one another, and this friendship would soon turn out to be extremely sour. Lawrence Bittaker was born in Pittsville, Pennsylvania in September 27, 1940, as the unwanted child of a couple who didn't actually want children. Bittaker was placed in an orphanage by his natural mother and was actually adopted by Mr. and Mrs. Bittaker. I think they were his auntie and uncle. Bittaker's adoptive father worked in the aviation industry, so that meant that he had to travel around the United States, frequently moving from house to house. All this movement between the towns, like making friends and then having to leave them again, would have had some sort of impact on his mental health. Bittaker was first arrested for shoplifting at age 12 and obtained a minor criminal record over the next 4 years after further arrests for the same offence. And then these further arrests brought the attention of the juvenile authorities. Although reported to have an IQ of about 138, Bittaker considered school to be quite tedious and he didn't really enjoy it or like to go, and he dropped out of school in 1957. Within a year of him dropping out of school, he had been arrested for car theft, a hit and run, and evading his arrest. For these offences, he was actually imprisoned at California Youth Authority, and where he stayed until he was 18 years old. Upon release, Bittaker discovered that his adoptive parents had abandoned him and just left, and he would never actually see them again. In 1960, Bittaker was released from prison again and soon reverted to life of crime. In 1966, Bittaker underwent further examinations by psychiatrists, both of who classed him as borderline psychopath. In 1974, Bittaker was actually arrested again for assault and the attempt to commit murder after he stabbed a young supermarket employee who accused him of stealing. Bittaker responded to this by stabbing the young employee in the chest, narrowly missing his heart. He attempted to flee the scene but was quickly caught up by another employee who worked there and restrained. The employee, Gary Louis, who actually got stabbed, did actually survive the attack, and Bittaker was actually convicted of the lesser charge of assault with a deadly weapon and sent to California Men's Colony. While Bittaker was in federal prison, he was actually given a test as what they would give to prison guards to become a prison guard, and he scored the highest mark in the history of the federal system. Similarly to Bittaker, Roy Norris actually grew up quite a misfit as well. He was born in Greeley, Colorado on February 5th, 1948. Norris's extended family lived within a short distance to the parents' home due to his grandfather's real estate investments. His father worked in a scrapyard and his mother was a drug-addicted housewife. Norris claims he was sexually abused by the Hispanic family that actually took care of him at a certain time, and that's where his hatred towards Hispanics came from. Whilst living with his birth parents at age 16, Norris actually visited a female relative's house where he turned up and started speaking really sexually towards her. She, who at the time was 20 years old, ordered him to leave the house, and then informed Norris's father, who subjected Norris to beating. Norris subsequently stole his father's car and drove up to the Rocky Mountains, where he attempted to commit suicide several times by injecting pure air into his veins. He was later apprehended as a runaway and sent back to live with his parents. Upon his return home, Norris's parents actually said to him and his sister that they were unwanted children, and they intended to divorce when both of them reached adolescence. At age 17, a year later, Norris actually dropped out of school and joined the US Navy. He was stationed in San Diego in 1965 and deployed to Vietnam in 1969, although he did not see any active combat in the 4-month tour of duty. In 1969, Roy Norris was actually arrested for his first known sexual offence. He was charged with both rape and the attempt to commit rape. In the latter of the offence, he had actually tried to force his way into the car of a young woman. 3 months later, in February 1970, Norris attempted to deceive a lone woman in the attempt to get into her house. The woman phoned the police before Norris had any opportunity to basically harm this woman. Less than 3 months after this offence, Norris was actually diagnosed by military psychologists as having a severe schizoid personality. In May 1970, Norris, who was actually on bail for his latest offence, attacked a female student who had been stalking on the grounds of San Diego State University campus. Norris repeatedly struck her on the back of the head with a rock until she slumped over onto her knees, before he repeatedly bumped her head against the sidewalk as he knelt upon her low back. Shortly thereafter, Norris was actually charged with assault with a deadly weapon and was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. In prison, he was actually classified as a mentally disordered sex offender. In 1975, just 3 months after his release, Norris approached a 27-year-old woman who had had an argument with a boyfriend and offered her a ride on his motorbike. When she declined and started walking off on the road on Redondo Beach, Norris had actually got off his bike, parked it up, ran over to the woman, grabbed her scarf, strangled her, twisting it around her neck, before informing her that he intended to rape her and then dragging her off into some bushes. Although the rape was actually reported to the police, they was initially unable to find the perpetrator. However, 1 month later, the victim actually saw his bike and recognised his registration plate and then reported that to the police. Norris was then arrested for the rape, which was 1 year later to when it actually happened. Then he was tried and then actually convicted and sent to California Men's Colony. While incarcerated at California Men's Colony, he was then introduced to Lawrence Bittaker and formed this friendship with him. Bittaker and Norris initially became friends in 1977, a whole year after Norris had actually arrived there. Bittaker's initial impressions of Norris when he arrived at the colony was that he was kind of like a savvy individual who largely associated with like hardened gangs and was involved in like motorcycle gangs, and then also in addition to dealing with contraband drugs. According to Norris, Bittaker had actually saved him from like a few like arguments and fellow inmates trying to attack him. In 1978, the pair had become close acquaintances, discovering they shared a common interest in sexual violence and misogyny, with also Norris divulging to Bittaker that his biggest stimulation was seeing the fear of young women. Bittaker, who is not actually known to have committed any sexual offences before meeting up with Norris, divulged to Norris that if he was ever to rape anyone, that he would kill them straight after, so that it would be leaving no witnesses to the crime. When alone, the pair actually were frequently discussing what they would do when they were released, and that was to basically kidnap, rape, and then murder young girls. This shared fantasy that both of them had then escalated into a plan of what exactly they would do when they were released from prison, and this would be to abduct and then murder a girl from each teenage aged from 13 through to 19. The pair vowed to become reacquainted after they both released and would meet up in the South Bay area. Bittaker was released from California Men's Colony on October 15, 1978, and he returned to Los Angeles where he worked as a skilled machinist for an aircraft company. This work earned Bittaker close to a six-figure salary, and this is for someone who is an ex-convict as well. 3 months after Bittaker was actually released from California Men's Colony on January 15, 1979, Norris was released from prison and moved back in with his mother on Redondo Beach. He soon found employment as an electrician in Compton. Shortly thereafter, he then received a letter from Bittaker. In late February, the pair met up in a local bar and then rekindled their plan of the rape and murder of young girls. In order for the pair to become successful with these abductions, they needed a vehicle that they would get around with, and they'd need a van instead of a car, is what they'd discussed. Bittaker purchased a silver 1977 GMC cargo van in February of 1979. The vehicle was windowless and had large sliding passenger doors. According to Bittaker, when viewing the doors, he actually realised he or Norris could actually pull up alongside a young girl, not have the door fully open, and then drag them in. Bittaker and Norris actually named their van Murder Mac, after LA's notorious duo, the Hillside Strangler Murders, who had also named their killing machine the same thing. And what makes it even worse is that they named it as a tribute, so it just shows how sick in the head they actually were. From February to June in 1979, Bittaker and Norris actually picked up over 20 girls along the California Pacific Coast Highway. This was basically just done as like test runs for Bittaker and Norris. It was basically just to see who was willing to get in the van with them, and if they had to force them or if they didn't, just things like that. It's just so that they could evaluate the situation for when they actually committed the crimes. As I say, they were both just developing the tactics of how they would kidnap these girls and then take them to secluded locations. They would like flirt and photograph and just basically be really kind of creepy with these girls. In late April, the pair actually discovered a secluded fire road located in the San Gabriel Mountains. Bittaker broke the lock on the fire road with his own crowbar and actually replaced the lock with his own, and this would be the location of where the men took the girls to rape and torture them. Bittaker and Norris's first victim, 16-year-old Lucinda Schaefer, was last seen leaving a Presbyterian church meeting on Redondo Beach, where she stayed for only 20 minutes before leaving and walking home. In his written accounts of the day, Bittaker actually says that he and Norris were both finishing off constructing the bed that they had installed into the van, beneath which they placed a selection of tools and a cooler filled with like soft drinks and beer. At approximately 11 AM, the pair drove to the beach, drinking beer and smoking weed, and flirting with all the girls and stuff that were there. They basically said that they had no like set routine as to what time they went when they were looking out for these people. At approximately 7:46 p.m, Norris spotted Schaefer walking down the street and alerted Bittaker. After unsuccessfully attempting to entice Schaefer into the van with alternatives of like marijuana and a lift home, Schaefer actually still declined this offer. Norris then drove further ahead and parked up alongside a driveway. Norris then exited the vehicle, walked around the other side, and then opened the passenger sliding door, and then basically peered into it. When Lucinda Schaefer actually passed by the van, he came back out and then exchanged some words with her before actually grabbing her, and then dragging her into the van, using a ruse that they would repeat in their subsequent murders. Bittaker turned up the volume fully as Norris actually bound the victim's arm and legs with duct tape. Bittaker then drove Schaefer an hour away up the road to that fire road that they had in the San Gabriel Mountains. Despite initially screaming when she was first abducted, Lucinda Schaefer then regained composure. In his written account of what actually followed that night, Bittaker wrote that she actually shed no tears, she was quite calm, and he then also said that he felt like she knew what was coming. At the fire road, Norris actually raped Schaefer after instructing Bittaker to go off and take a walk for an hour. Upon returning to the van, Bittaker then raped Schaefer as Norris went on a walk as well. Upon the second occasion where she was actually raped again by Norris in Bittaker's absence, Schaefer then asked whether they intended to kill her, to which Norris replied no. In response to this, Schaefer actually asked if she could pray if their intention was to actually kill her. In the subsequent accounts of the actual murder, Bittaker and Norris actually said that they had an argument over whether to keep her alive or actually kill her. Norris then strangled her, but after about 45 seconds, Norris became disturbed and then ran to the back of the van and actually threw up. Bittaker then manually strangled Schaefer until she collapsed to the ground and started convulsing. He then twisted a wire coat hanger around her neck and used vice grip pliers to actually tighten it until she stopped breathing. Lucinda Schaefer's body was then actually wrapped in a plastic shower curtain and then thrown over a steep canyon Bittaker had selected. After throwing her over, Bittaker then assured Norris that not to worry because the animals would take care of it and leave no evidence. After no witnesses or evidence to suggest the pair had committed the crime, the case went cold and it was not further looked into. On July 5th, 1979, 2 weeks after the murder of Lucinda Schaefer, Bittaker and Norris encountered their next victim, 18-year-old Andrea Hall, who was actually hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway. Andrea Hall was actually from Ohio, who originally lived in quite a poor family, who came over to this area to try and better herself and make some more money for herself. She was actually low on money at this time, so she decided to go out and sell her blood for a little bit of extra cash, and on her way home, she decided to hitchhike. As the pair slowed down to offer Hall a lift, another van pulled up at the side and offered her the same thing, as to which she accepted to not the pair, but this other van. Bittaker and Norris then followed this van until she was actually dropped off again, where they decided to pick her up on Redondo Beach. On this occasion, Norris actually hid in the back of the van to make it look like Bittaker was the only one there and that he was travelling alone. Inside the van, Bittaker had actually offered Hall like a soft drink to basically entice her into the van, and then Norris actually jumped out from under the bed that they had put inside the van. When Hall went to go retrieve this drink, as I say, he jumped out, and then after a strenuous fight and putting her arm behind her back to basically restrain her from doing anything, she was then obviously dragged into the van. Norris then gagged Hall with adhesive tape and then tied her wrists and ankles together. Bittaker and Norris had then driven Hall up to the fire road in the San Gabriel Mountains where they'd taken Lucinda Schaefer. At this location she was raped twice by Bittaker and once by Norris. Whilst Bittaker was raping Hall for the second time, Norris actually stopped it and basically said that he'd seen the headlights of a car coming towards him. Bittaker then put his hand over Hall's mouth, basically to shut her up from screaming, and then Norris actually got back into the van and headed out while Bittaker was in like a bush to the side with Hall. After an unsuccessful search and he returned back to Bittaker, they both got in the van and then drove further up to the secluded location. Bittaker then forced Hall to walk up alongside the road naked and then also perform oral sex on him. After this, he then ordered Hall to pose for Polaroid pictures that he were going to take. The pair were described as like sexual sadists, and the essential feature of sexual sadism is a feeling of like sexual like excitement towards like the torture and like administering pain and suffering or humiliating another person, and then basically getting the excitement from that. And then this is obviously why they were both getting the thrills out of making these girls do sexual things for their own enjoyment. After taking the Polaroid pictures, Bittaker and Norris then drove Hall to another third secluded location, where Bittaker again walked Hall up a nearby hill. This time Norris actually drove to a nearby store to go purchase alcohol. When Norris returned, Bittaker was actually in possession of another 2 Polaroid pictures that he'd taken, both of which were described as showing Hall's face to be of sheer terror, as she begged for her life to be spared. Bittaker had informed Norris that he'd taken Hall to a different location, where he'd got her to basically beg and to give reasons as to why she should live. Although, even though he'd asked her to do that, he'd already made up his mind about wanting to kill her anyway, but it was basically just to show that he had that power and was that manipulative to make this person do that in that situation, again, getting his excitement and thrills from all this. So I do actually have to give you a warning before I get into this next bit. It is quite gory, so if you are someone who doesn't want to hear anything about how this person was murdered, then please do skip forward. After taking Hall to this different location, Bittaker then thrust an ice pick straight through Hall's ear. He then turned Hall's body over, thrusting the ice pick through the other ear and then stomping on it until the handle had actually broken. Bittaker then strangled Schaefer and then threw her body off the side of a cliff and then went back to Norris to show him the pictures that he had taken. Schaefer's sister and then brother-in-law had actually reported her missing to the LAPD. After news about these 2 missing girls broke out, Bittaker and Norris had actually remained silent and laid low for 2 months. Then decided to go straight back out after this, having a break because there was no evidence to suggest that it was them 2 or there was no suspicions pointing towards them. On September 3rd, whilst driving to Redondo Beach, Bittaker and Norris had actually observed 2 young girls. These 2 girls was Jackie Gilliam and Jacqueline Lamp, and they were actually sat on a bench trying to get a lift down to the beach. Bittaker and Norris actually offered both of the girls a ride down to the beach, and Gillian and Lamp both accepted this offer and then got into the van. Inside the van, both of the girls were actually offered marijuana, and they both accepted this as well. Shortly after entering the van, both the girls noticed that Bittaker had actually steered off the Pacific Coast Highway and was driving towards San Gabriel Mountains. When the girls obviously protested this and were like, "Let us get out of the van," the pair reassured the girls, saying that they were only going to this other location just so that they could smoke this weed that they had. And the girls obviously didn't believe it, so they tried to get out of the van. Lamp, aged 13, actually attempted to open the sliding doors and jump out, but Norris had actually filled her bag with lead weights and hit her over the head, completely knocking her unconscious, before then overpowering 15-year-old Jackie Gilliam, who was then trying to fight him off of her. As he began to bind and gag Gilliam, Lamp regained consciousness and then tried to escape the van a second time. And then Norris used the same technique as he did on Lucinda Schaefer by putting her arm behind her back and then making her just basically helpless. As this struggle was actually happening, Bittaker then saw that this was in full view of people who were actually playing tennis, because they'd literally parked right next to a tennis court. He then obviously shouted across to the people who were playing tennis, who were looking over, saying that the girls were just having a bad LSD trip. He then drove a little bit further forward, pulled over again, punched Gilliam in the face, and then helped assisting Norris in the both binding and gagging of both the 2 girls. Gillian and Lamp were then driven to the San Gabriel Mountains on the fire road that I'd mentioned earlier, and they were both kept there for 2 days. They were held captive for these 2 days, and amongst these 2 days they were actually physically and sexually abused. Both men slept along the hostages and were both taking it in turns as a lookout. On one occasion, Bittaker had actually walked Lamp up a nearby hill where he forced her to pose for pornographic pictures before returning back to show Norris them at the van. Bittaker also informed Norris that he had to go off and take sexual pictures with Gilliam, both nude and clothed. In the first of the 3 instances where Bittaker had actually raped Gilliam, he also created a tape recording of himself actually raping her, forcing the girl to basically pretend that she was one of his cousins who he had fantasies about, and then basically telling her to express any pain that she felt, because, as I said before, that's what they get their excitement from. Bittaker then later claimed that he'd buried this tape in a graveyard nearby, but it was never actually found. This bit is also quite gruesome, so I do have to warn you again. Bittaker is also known to have tortured Gillian by stabbing her in the breast with the ice pick, and using vice grip pliers to actually tear off one part of a nipple. After almost 2 days of being held in captivity, Gillian and Lamp were both murdered. At Bittaker's subsequent trial, Norris claimed that he had suggested that Gillian be killed as quickly as she could. As unlike Lamp, she had actually been quite cooperative with what the men were asking, where Bittaker actually replied, "No, they only die once anyway." Gillian was actually struck in each ear with the ice pick and then strangled to death. After Bittaker had actually murdered Jackie Gilliam, he then forced Jacqueline Lamb out of the van. Upon exiting the sliding door, Bittaker shouted to her, "You wanted to stay a virgin, now you can die a virgin," before Norris struck her upon the head with a sledgehammer. Bittaker then strangled Lamb until he believed that she had actually died. When Lamb had actually opened her eyes after this, Norris then began beating her over the head, whilst Bittaker had actually strangled her. The bodies of Jackie Gilliam and Jacqueline Lamb were then thrown over an embankment into the chaparral. Bittaker and Norris abducted their final victim, 16-year-old Shirley Lynette Ledford, on October 31st, 1979. Ledford was actually abducted as she stood outside a gas station waiting for a hitchhike home after attending a Halloween party. This was in the Sunland suburb of Los Angeles after she'd actually fallen out with her boyfriend, so she had no way of actually getting home. Investigators believe that Ledford had actually accepted this lift from Bittaker and Norris because she recognised Bittaker from a restaurant that she worked at as a waitress, and Bittaker had regularly visited this restaurant, so she thought it was like a familiar face. So when he'd asked, she'd obviously accepted it and then got in because she knew of kind of who he was. Upon accepting this lift home, Norris had actually offered her marijuana, which she declined. Bittaker then drove to a secluded location and Norris drew out a knife, then bound and gagged Ledford with construction tape. Bittaker then traded places with Norris and then got into the back to be with Ledford. After removing the construction tape from her mouth and legs, Bittaker then reported to torment Ledford, initially slapping her and just basically mocking her, and then repeatedly beating her with his fist, basically getting her to say something, is what he'd said. And then as Shirley Ledford began screaming, he was then carrying on beating her, saying "scream louder." As Ledford continued screaming and Bittaker was still continually beating her, he was then saying, "What's the matter? Do you not like to scream?" Again, this next bit is quite detailed about the torture of her, so if you do not want to listen to it, please do skip forward. As Ledford began to cry, she pleaded with Bittaker, saying, "No, stop hitting me." In response, Bittaker again then ordered her to scream as loud as she wanted. He then alternatively started beating her with a hammer and just punching her breasts as well with his fists, and then just torturing her with the pliers between instances of the torture and then the rape of her as well. Repeatedly, Ledford can be heard screaming "oh no" as sounds of Bittaker retrieving either a sledgehammer or some of the pliers from the toolbox are heard from the tape recording that he had actually switched on to record as soon as she entered the van. Shortly after, Norris switched places with Bittaker and then himself turned on the recorder again. Norris then first shouted to Ledford saying, "Scream or I'll make you scream." In response, Ledford said that she will scream if you stopped hitting her. Norris then was encouraging her to carry on screaming until he ordered her to stop. Norris then reached for the sledgehammer, and as you can hear from the recording, Shirley Ledford then screamed "oh no" as she saw what was about to happen. Norris then struck Ledford on the left elbow. In response to this, she pled with Norris, saying that he'd actually broken her elbow and to not hit her again, which he just ignored and continued to hit her left elbow. In total, he hit her 25 consecutive times in the elbow with this sledgehammer and then basically said, "What are you snivelling about?" It was said by Roy Norris that we've all heard women scream in horror films, still we know that no one is really screaming. This is just simply because an actress can't produce some sounds that convince us that something vile and heinous is happening. If you ever hear that tape, there is just no possible way that you'd not begin crying or trembling. I doubt you could listen to more than a full 60 seconds of it. And this is actually Roy Norris, who is describing the audio tape that the pair had actually recorded of Shirley Ledford's rape and torture in April of 1979. I'm not actually going to be putting the recording from the tape in this video. I will leave a link in the description to a video that actually does play the recording, so you can listen to that yourself, but I do have to warn you, it is really truly horrific just listening back. It's just the sheer terror that she must have gone through is just awful. So yeah, please do listen at your own risk. After approximately 2 hours in captivity, Norris had actually killed her with the wire coat hanger that he used in multiple other murders and then tightened it with the pliers. Bittaker then opted to basically just put Ledford's body just out in the open, just so that everyone can see it, just on somebody's lawn. This was done to basically try and get a reaction out of the press. The pair drove to a randomly selected house in Sunland and discarded of the body, laying her in a bed of ivy on somebody's front lawn. Shirley Lynette Ledford's body was actually found the next morning by a jogger. Now, this bit is also quite gruesome, so again, I do have to warn you about it. An autopsy revealed that in addition to having the strangulation and being sexually violated, she had died also after retrieving blunt force trauma to the head, face and breasts, and also again the left elbow, which I talked about, which had been completely fractured. Her genitalia and also rectum had also been torn, caused in part by Bittaker, where he'd actually inserted the pliers into her body. In addition, her left hand had actually bore a puncture, and the finger on her right hand had actually been slashed. Bittaker claimed that the tape that was found of the recording of this murder taking place was none other than just the threesome that the three of them had had. Then at the end, adding that Shirley Ledford was actually screaming for the two men to kill her, and it was like her that had forced them to do it. In November of 1979, Roy Norris became acquainted with an old friend, Joseph Jackson, an individual who at the same time as Norris had actually been incarcerated in California men's colony. Norris confided to Jackson about his basically antics that he and Bittaker did from the previous 5 months, also going into like really detailed descriptions about what he did with these girls that they'd abducted, raped, tortured and murdered. He went into most detail about Shirley Ledford, and this was the only victim whose body had actually been found at this time. Norris also divulged to Jackson that in addition to these 5 murders, that there were also 3 other people that they had attempted to abduct and torture and murder, but they had been able to escape. And it was actually a young woman who they had actually succeeded in raping, but she had actually ran off and managed to escape. Upon hearing Norris's confessions, Jackson actually went back to his attorney basically to ask what he should do about this situation. His attorney then advised him to go to the authority, basically to tell them about this, because Jackson had actually felt like the way that he was describing it was that he was trying to get at Jackson's 2 girls, because he actually had 2 younger girls, and then also felt like what they'd done to the girls, he felt awful because obviously he had 2 girls of his own. Jackson agreed with his attorney that he could go and basically tell the Los Angeles Police Department about this, and then in return for this, they relayed the 2 men to the Redondo Beach Police. A Redondo Beach detective named Paul Bynum was actually assigned to investigate Jackson's claims about the 2 men. Bynum initially noted that these claims from Jackson actually did match what had been reported on several girls that had actually gone missing in that area. They were actually matching up with what Norris had told Jackson. In addition to these, Norris had actually said to Jackson that he'd sprayed mace in the face of a woman who had been dragged into Bittaker's van and raped by both the men, and this matched a report that had happened on September the 30th. In this filed report, a young woman named Robin Robeck had actually said that she'd had mace sprayed in her face before she was dragged into a van and raped by 2 men, before actually being released. Although Robeck had actually reported this to the police, they were actually unable to basically find any perpetrators. Bynum dispatched an investigator to go visit Robin Robeck and basically show her a series of mugshots. Without hesitation, Robeck basically just pointed out Norris and Bittaker from this lineup of pictures that they had and identified those 2 men as the people who kidnapped her and raped her. Upon linking Bittaker and Norris to the rape of Robin Robeck, the Hermosa Beach Police placed Norris under surveillance, and then under days of being under surveillance, he was actually seen dealing marijuana and putting it into bags and weighing it up. On November 20th, 1979, Norris was then arrested by the Hermosa Beach Police for violation of his parole. The same day, at a Burbank motel, Bittaker was also arrested for the rape of Robin Robeck. Although Robeck had actually been able to identify these mugshots, when it came up to the lineup, she wasn't able to basically 100% pinpoint it on, yes, it was them 2. So both weren't actually charged for this, they were both just charged for the parole violation. In a search of Bittaker's apartment, the police had actually found Polaroids, which were soon identified as Andrea Hall and Jackie Gilliam, both of who had actually been reported missing earlier in the same year. Inside Bittaker's van, they discovered a sledgehammer, a plastic bag filled with lead weights, a book detailing how to locate police frequencies, a jar of Vaseline, 2 necklaces, which were believed to have belonged to the victims, and a tape recording of a woman who was in obvious distress. The mother of Shirley Ledford, named by Joseph Jackson, who was one of the people who Norris and Bittaker had actually murdered, identified the voice who was on the recording to be that of her daughter, Shirley Ledford. Also found in Bittaker's motel were bottles of acidic materials that would have been later used on another attack, as they had planned to use it on their next victim. In Norris's apartment, police had actually discovered a bracelet that was actually taken from Shirley Ledford as a souvenir for this murder. And then again, after more investigation of both of the homes, there were found over 500 Polaroid pictures of random girls, both found at Norris and Bittakers, like places where they stayed. All of the pictures were taken at either the Redondo Beach or Hermosa Beach, with others taken by Bittaker at Burbank High School. It also seemed like most of these pictures that had been taken were without the girls' consent or without them actually knowing that the photograph was being taken. On November 30th, 1979, Norris attended a preliminary hearing in relation to the September 30th rape of Robin Roebuck. By this stage, Norris was actually beginning to basically show off signs of stress and being in distress at what he was hearing and things. Initially, Norris just denied any involvement in the murders or rapes of any of the girls. However, when confronted with all the evidence and everything against him, he then started to confess. Although he did try and portray Bittaker to be the more the leader in this situation. Bittaker and Norris basically tried to put across that it was voluntary that they were getting into the vans and that it was their own choice, that they weren't actually forcing, but it was later found out that the first instance there was actually force used to get the girl into the van. Bittaker had actually admitted to bludgeoning their youngest victim, Jacqueline Lamp, by hitting her over the head with a sledgehammer, as Bittaker was strangling her, and admitted to repeatedly beating Shirley Ledford's the left elbow with the sledgehammer, before then strangling her to death. The bottles of acid found at Bittaker's motel were actually intended to be used on the next victim, as they had planned to use it for fun, the thing that I mentioned earlier. According to Norris, the level of brutality that Bittaker actually exhibited on these girls that they'd abducted increased on each occurrence of a girl being lured into the van. Additional details provided by Norris were actually further confirming evidence to support the confessions. For example, he knew that the first victim, Lucinda Schaefer, had left the meeting from the church and had lost one shoe before being dragged into the van. And then also Norris knew that one part of Shirley Ledford's family was Hispanic, and that Bittaker had actually unsuccessfully been able to date her in October of 1979. One of the individuals depicted on the Polaroids that were actually seized from the home shows an unidentified white young woman in circumstances found that were very similar to known victims Andrea Hall, Jacqueline Lamb, and Jackie Gilliam. The young woman in these pictures has actually never been identified still, and this is someone who Bittaker and Norris have never actually mentioned in any of the trials or any of the investigations. Norris then agreed to return to the San Gabriel Mountains to basically help the police with the search for the bodies of the girls who had actually been reported missing, to basically try and help find them. In each of the instances, Norris actually brought the police to where he and Bittaker disposed of the girls' bodies, and the bodies of Lucinda Schaefer and Andrea Hall were never actually found, even after the search of Norris taking the police to these different locations. Nonetheless, on February 9th in 1980, the skeletalised bodies of Jacqueline Lamp and Jackie Gilliam were found at the bottom of a canyon alongside a dry riverbed. The bodies were scattered over an area covered of 100 metres, and the ice pick was still actually found lodged in the side of the skull of Jackie Gilliam. In February of 1980, Norris and Bittaker were formally charged with the murder of 5 girls. At the arraignment, Bittaker was actually denied bail, whereas Norris's bail were actually set to $10,000. Within 1 month of being charged with the murders, Norris had actually accepted a plea bargain where he could therefore testify against Bittaker in return for the prosecution not to seek the death penalty against him. On March 18, 1980, Roy Norris pled guilty to the 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder in relation to the victim of Andrea Hall, 2 counts of rape and 1 count of robbery. On May 7th, 1980, Roy Norris was sentenced to 45 years to life imprisonment, with eligibility of parole in 2010. On April 24th, 1980, Lawrence Bittaker was arraigned on the 29 counts of kidnapping, rape, sodomy, and murder, and also in addition to various other charges, and then possession of a firearm as well. Again, like I mentioned earlier, the charges of the Robin Roebuck rape were actually dropped due to lack of sufficient evidence, and then again, Roebuck being unable to identify the attackers in the lineup. Several witnesses testified against Bittaker after he had actually shown them the Polaroid pictures that he'd taken of the girls as a keepsake which had been found in his motel. One witness, a 17-year-old girl who was actually the neighbour to Bittaker, named Christina Drally, testified that Bittaker had actually shown her the picture of Jackie Gilliam and saying that the girls I get won't talk anymore. More than 100 people were present during the listening to the Shirley Ledford tape. Like, the jury and all the audience members were all like, felt awful listening to it. So I don't know if you have listened to it already before continuing with the video, or if you're going to listen to it afterwards. So as I say, like, the atmosphere just completely changed after listening to this tape in the courtroom. People were either like burying their head in their hands, like grabbing the tissues to wipe away the tears, or even in some instances people were literally running out of the courtroom just so that they didn't have to hear any more of the tape that was being played for them. Bittaker was just sat, like, undisturbed throughout the whole course of this tape that was playing. Like, he showed no remorse or no, like, action to suggest that he was disturbed by it. And it was also reported that he was actually, like, seen smiling a bit throughout the recording. Bittakers Trial actually lasted over 3 weeks. On February 17th, 1981, after 3 days, the jury found Bittaker guilty of 5 counts of murder, 1 charge of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, 5 charges of kidnapping, 9 charges of rape, 2 charges of forcible oral copulation, 1 charge of sodomy, and 3 charges of unlawful possession of a firearm. The jury deliberated for about 90 minutes whether or not he should get the death penalty, and shortly thereafter returned with the verdict. Bittaker was then sentenced to death on the 5 counts of the murder charges and everything else. He showed absolutely no emotion at all to this verdict. On March 24th, in addition to this verdict, Lawrence Bittaker was formally sentenced to death. As of 2019, Lawrence Bittaker remains incarcerated on death row at San Quentin State Prison. Roy Norris remains incarcerated at Donovan State Prison. And then since his conviction, he has claimed that it was solely down to being manipulated and out of fear of Bittaker why he committed these crimes. And then he also claims that he deterred 3 different instances, preventing them from getting into the van and being prevented of rape, and eventually could have led to murder. Roy Norris became eligible for parole in 2009, and he declined this hearing, thereby deterring his eligibility for parole again by another 10 years, leading up till 2019, so this year, where he then is eligible for parole again. The audio tape that Bittaker and Norris actually created when raping and torturing Shirley Ledford is now used by the FBI, and it's held by the FBI Academy, basically just to train and basically desensitise any FBI agents to the raw reality of torture and murder, which is awful because I can't believe that it's been used for something like that. So yeah, that does bring us to the end of this video, and it is quite a long one, so hopefully it does make up for me missing out on last week's video. Yeah, I hope you did basically find it interesting and got as much information as that you would have liked out of this video. And thank you if you did make it this far, because I know it is quite difficult to watch longer videos, but just know that a lot of research, a lot of hard work did actually go into this video and creating the video. So yeah, like I said, if you did find it informative, please do leave a like on this video and subscribe for more content, turning post notifications on as well to stay up to date with my True Crime Tuesday videos that come out every single Tuesday. So yeah, thank you so much for watching.